Malik Thompson had been looking forward to this Saturday for weeks. As a biologist, he had spent the majority of his time in front of a computer screen or in a lab, analyzing data and reading research papers. The idea of getting out into nature, where he could see wildlife in its natural habitat, always excited him. This weekend, he had planned to visit a local national park to conduct some field research on the park's rare plant species. He had his notebook, his camera, and his trusted binoculars ready. He drove to the park early in the morning, hoping to make the most of the daylight hours. As Malik made his way to the park entrance, he couldn't help but admire the beauty of the landscape. The towering trees, the sound of birds chirping, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze, all of it made him feel at peace. It was a sharp contrast to the constant hustle and bustle of city life. The park was a place where he could think clearly, observe his surroundings, and be in his element. Malik knew that the quiet of the park would allow him to focus and do his work without distractions. It was exactly what he needed after a long, stressful week of research. When he parked his car near one of the trails, Malik noticed that the park was fairly busy. Families were gathered at picnic tables, hikers were passing by with backpacks slung over their shoulders, and tourists were taking pictures by the trailhead. It wasn't unusual to see the park filled with visitors, especially on weekends. As a regular park goer, Malik had grown used to the presence of others, and it rarely bothered him. In fact, he enjoyed seeing the diversity of people who came to appreciate nature. However, something about this visit felt different. As Malik began to gather his equipment, he felt a strange sensation in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't the excitement he usually felt before an adventure, it was more like a subtle sense of unease. Perhaps it was the way some of the people around him looked at him, a lingering glance or a sudden shift in their posture. He couldn't quite place it, but something felt off. Still, he shrugged off the feeling and pushed it to the back of his mind. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let his own doubts interfere. With a deep breath, Malik set off along the trail. His boots crunched on the gravel path as he made his way deeper into the woods. The trail was well maintained, with signs marking different routes for hikers and nature enthusiasts. The air was fresh, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patches of light on the forest floor. Malik's focus shifted to his surroundings as he began to scan the area for the specific plant species he had come to study. He was in his element now, fully immersed in his work, taking notes and snapping photos along the way. As he walked further down the trail, Malik heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw two park rangers walking briskly toward him. They were in uniform, their dark green shirts and pants matching the color of the surrounding forest. Their expressions were serious, almost stern, as they approached him. Malik felt a flicker of discomfort as they drew closer, but he greeted them politely with a nod. "Good morning," Malik said, offering a warm smile. He had encountered park rangers before and knew they were there to ensure the park's rules were followed. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming they were just doing their job. One of the rangers, a tall man with a square jaw and short cropped hair, looked Malik up and down. "What are you doing here?" the ranger asked bluntly, his tone cold. Malik was taken aback by the abruptness of the question. "I'm conducting research on the local plant species," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He showed the ranger the notebook he had brought along with the camera. The ranger glanced at the notebook, then at Malik's face. There was something in his eyes that made Malik's stomach twist. The ranger didn't seem interested in the research, he was scrutinizing Malik, sizing him up in a way that made him feel uncomfortable. "Do you have a permit for research in this area?" the ranger asked, his voice still detached. Malik's eyebrows furrowed. "Yes, I do," he said, reaching into his backpack to pull out the proper paperwork. He had gone through the proper channels to get approval for his field work, and he always made sure to follow the rules when visiting public spaces. The last thing he wanted was to cause trouble. The second ranger, a woman with short blonde hair, crossed her arms and stepped closer. "We're going to need to see more than that," she said, her tone now suspicious. "Do you have any other identification?" Malik felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was unusual. Normally, park rangers would simply check the permits and move on, but the way they were interrogating him felt off. He handed over his ID and waited as the rangers examined it carefully. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the judgment in their eyes. It was as if they had already decided he was in the wrong, even before they had all the facts. The rangers continued to ask him questions, probing into his background and the specifics of his research. Malik answered politely, though the growing tension made it harder to stay calm. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't questioning him for the usual reasons, they weren't just making sure he had the right permits. There was something more to it. The way they looked at him, the way they spoke, it was as though they had already made up their minds about him. But why? As the questions continued, Malik started to feel like he was being singled out. The rangers were acting like he didn't belong there. He had been to this park countless times before, and he had never once been treated with such suspicion. It wasn't just the questions, it was the way the rangers were speaking to him. There was an underlying hostility in their voices, something that made Malik's heart race. "Do you even belong here?" the male ranger asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing. The question hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Malik's pulse quickened. What did he mean by that? The comment felt out of place, and for the first time that day, Malik began to wonder if this was more than just an ordinary routine check. It was almost as though the ranger was implying that he didn't belong in the park because of his race. Malik had faced racism before, small, subtle acts that made him feel out of place, but this felt different. It felt deliberate. As the rangers continued to ask more questions, Malik's mind raced. Could this really be happening? Could they actually be judging him simply because of the color of his skin? He wanted to believe it wasn't possible, but deep down, he couldn't ignore the signs. He had been in situations like this before, where people treated him differently because of his race, but this felt more aggressive, more intentional. He knew he had to stay calm, but the more the rangers interrogated him, the harder it became to stay composed. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. Malik's nerves were on edge, but he fought to keep his composure. He couldn't understand what was happening. Why were these park rangers acting this way? Was it really just a misunderstanding, or was something more troubling going on? The male ranger, still eyeing Malik suspiciously, flipped through the papers Malik had handed him, pausing on his ID. He glanced at it, then back at Malik, a sharp look in his eyes. "I'm going to have to ask you to stay right here," the ranger said in a clipped tone, before turning to the female ranger. "Call it in," he muttered, as if Malik was some kind of criminal. Malik's chest tightened as the female ranger walked off toward their patrol vehicle, her steps brisk, clearly determined to get to the bottom of whatever they believed Malik was hiding. Malik stood still, trying not to let his frustration and anxiety show. He didn't want to make the situation worse. He knew that when it came to law enforcement, especially in situations like this, any sign of anger or resistance could escalate things even further. He thought back to the countless times he had seen stories in the news about black individuals who had been mistreated or worse. He couldn't afford to make a scene, even though every part of him wanted to demand an explanation. His mind raced as he stood there. He thought of his work, the countless hours he had spent researching and studying the environment, his contributions to important projects, and how everything seemed to be crashing down in this moment. He had always prided himself on being an upstanding citizen. He followed the rules, respected authority, and had never been in trouble with the law. Yet here he was, alone in the woods, treated like a criminal. Why was it so hard to simply be left alone to do his job? The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The female ranger returned with her radio, speaking into it urgently. Malik couldn't hear the words, but he could guess what she was saying. They were probably calling in more officers, trying to confirm something, anything, that would justify the way they were treating him. His stomach churned as he thought about the consequences. What would happen if they decided to take this further? What if this was just the beginning of something much bigger? As the female ranger spoke into the radio, Malik caught a glimpse of a family passing by on the trail. They looked at him, then quickly glanced away, avoiding his gaze. It was as if they didn't want to get involved, or maybe they were just too uncomfortable with what was happening to offer any support. Malik couldn't blame them. What could they possibly do? He was alone, and whatever was happening to him, he had no idea how to stop it. "Sir," the male ranger called out suddenly, his voice cutting through Malik's thoughts. "You're being detained for suspicion of trespassing." The words hung in the air, and Malik's mind briefly went blank. Trespassing? He couldn't believe it. He had every right to be here. His permits were valid, his research was legitimate. Yet, the ranger was speaking to him as if he were a criminal, as if he didn't belong. Malik tried to remain calm as he responded, his voice steady despite the rising tension inside him. "I'm not trespassing," he said firmly. "I have the proper permits, and I'm here to conduct research. You can check with the park office if you need verification." The male ranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the female ranger, who was still speaking on the radio. She nodded, confirming something, before walking over to the male ranger. Malik caught her muttering something under her breath, her face a mixture of doubt and annoyance. The moment was painfully awkward, and Malik could tell that the rangers were starting to feel the weight of the situation. Were they starting to doubt their own actions, or were they simply playing their part in what they believed to be a routine procedure? Without another word, the male ranger reached for his handcuffs, his fingers brushing the cold metal as he prepared to restrain Malik. The sight of the handcuffs made Malik's heart race. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet here they were, preparing to treat him like a criminal. His palms felt sweaty as he tried to steady himself. This wasn't happening, he told himself. This couldn't be real. "No," Malik said quickly, taking a step back. "Please. I'm not a criminal. I'm here to work. Just call the office, everything will be cleared up." But the male ranger didn't seem to hear him. The handcuffs clicked open, and Malik's stomach dropped. He couldn't believe it. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had followed the rules. Yet they were treating him as though he had done something unforgivable. He could feel the eyes of the other park visitors on him as the rangers moved closer. Some of them watched with curiosity, others with discomfort. No one spoke up. No one came to his defense. In that moment, Malik realized how alone he really was. He had always been careful to keep his head down, to stay out of trouble. But today, in this park, that didn't seem to matter. His race, his identity, it was all that the rangers saw. "You're under arrest," the male ranger said, his voice devoid of emotion. Malik's heart sank. "What?" he asked, barely able to process the words. "You're arresting me." The female ranger didn't speak, but Malik could see the cold determination in her eyes as she stepped forward. She was ready to assist in the arrest, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. And in a way, it was. For them, it seemed routine, like just another day on the job. For Malik, however, it was a nightmare he never expected. As the rangers moved to handcuff him, Malik's mind raced with questions. How had it come to this? Why were they doing this to him? He thought of his family, his colleagues, his research. He had worked so hard to get to this point in his life, and now, in the blink of an eye, it felt like it was all slipping away. What if this arrest ruined everything? What if people believed the Rangers' version of events instead of his? The Rangers led him toward their patrol vehicle, and Malik's heart pounded in his chest. He had to keep calm. He had to stay composed. He couldn't let them see how terrified he was. He could only hope that somehow, someone would believe him. That somehow, he could make it through this, and everything would be set right. But as he was placed in the back of the patrol car, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, he couldn't help but wonder how many others had been through the same thing, how many others had been judged before they even had a chance to speak. As the patrol car's engine hummed steadily, Malik's mind raced in a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief. He sat in the back of the car, his hands still cuffed, his body tense and stiff against the hard seat. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into his wrists, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the mental chaos swirling inside him. How had this even happened? One moment, he had been walking through the park, absorbed in his research, and the next, he was in the back of a police vehicle, heading to an unknown fate. The sounds outside the car seemed muffled, the usual bustle of the park growing distant as the vehicle moved further away. Malik tried to focus on his breathing, trying to slow his racing heart. He knew he had to stay calm. Panicking would only make things worse, and he couldn't afford to lose control now. He had been in stressful situations before. His work often required him to deal with demanding people, tight deadlines, and difficult environments. But nothing in his life had ever felt this surreal, this unjust. It was as though the world he had carefully built around himself had suddenly crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The rangers up front in the patrol vehicle didn't speak. The silence between them seemed thick and heavy, almost oppressive. Malik could feel the weight of their discomfort. They knew something wasn't right, but neither seemed willing to acknowledge it. Instead, they drove in silence, their focus entirely on the road ahead. Malik glanced out the window, watching the familiar landscape of the park slip away. His thoughts kept drifting back to the incident, replaying the moments over and over in his mind. Why had they arrested him? What had they seen in him that made them treat him like a criminal? In the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that it had to be about race. It had to be. His identity as a black man had always made him stand out in certain spaces, and today, it felt as though it had been the reason for everything. But why now? Why this park, this day? There were countless black people who visited parks, walked the trails, and conducted research just like he did. Why had they singled him out? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became, but he forced himself to quiet those emotions. Anger wasn't going to help him now. He needed to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. They drove for what felt like an eternity. Each minute stretched longer than the last. Malik's mind wandered back to the fieldwork he had planned for the day. He had been so excited about it, so determined to make the most of the opportunity. And now, all of it seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by this unjust situation. He had hoped to discover new plant species, to contribute something valuable to the scientific community, to make a difference. Now, his research seemed irrelevant in the face of this absurdity. Everything he had worked for could be jeopardized in a single moment, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Finally, after what felt like hours, the patrol car came to a stop. Malik's eyes shifted to the side, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The vehicle had parked in front of a small building, likely the local police station. His stomach churned with anxiety. This was the moment when everything could either be resolved or spiraled even further into chaos. He had no idea what awaited him inside, but he could feel his pulse quicken as the rangers got out of the car. One of them, the male ranger, opened the back door and motioned for Malik to get out. "You're being taken to the station for processing," the ranger said flatly, as though the words were nothing more than a formality. Malik said nothing, silently following the ranger's orders. The handcuffs made it difficult to move freely, but he managed to walk toward the building, his legs feeling heavy beneath him. The cold air seemed to cut through his jacket, but it wasn't the chill that made him shiver, it was the uncertainty of what was about to happen. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Malik was led down a narrow corridor. The sound of his shoes tapping against the linoleum floor echoed in the otherwise quiet space. The female ranger, still silent, walked behind him, her presence a constant reminder of the situation he found himself in. She never once met his gaze, keeping her focus on the floor ahead, as though she had nothing to do with what was happening. They reached a small room, its stark white walls and empty table standing in sharp contrast to the chaos inside Malik's mind. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, a sterile scent that did nothing to calm his nerves. The ranger motioned for Malik to sit in the metal chair by the table. As he did, the cuffs were finally removed, but the relief was fleeting. They hadn't set him free, they were just placing him in a holding room, waiting for something. Malik didn't know what it was. He didn't know how long they would keep him here or what they would do next. The seconds felt like hours as the rangers left the room, leaving Malik alone with his thoughts. The silence was deafening. His heart still pounded in his chest, and his mind refused to quiet down. Every worst-case scenario flashed before him, making it almost impossible to think straight. What if they didn't believe him? What if they tried to frame him for something he hadn't done? He had worked so hard to build his reputation, to earn his place in the scientific community. He had no criminal record. He had never been in trouble with the law. Yet here he was, sitting in a cold room, surrounded by people who had already decided his fate. It wasn't long before the door opened again. The male ranger re-entered the room, followed by a woman who Malik assumed was a supervisor. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance, as if she couldn't understand why he was even there. The supervisor didn't immediately speak, but the male ranger wasted no time. "We've run your background check," he said, his tone matter of fact. "And we're still trying to figure out why you were here without proper permission." Malik's mind went numb. His background check? His research permits? The truth should have been clear by now. He had provided everything they needed, and there was nothing in his record to suggest he was a troublemaker. He was a scientist, a respected professional. But somehow, that didn't seem to matter. "I told you already," Malik said, trying to remain calm, but frustration crept into his voice. "I'm here for research. I have all the necessary permits. You can call the office, they'll verify everything." The supervisor raised an eyebrow, as if she didn't believe a word he was saying. She turned to the male ranger, who seemed to hesitate for a moment before nodding. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "We'll check your story. But don't expect to be let go so easily. Not yet." The door shut again, leaving Malik in silence once more. As he sat there, he could only wonder, how long would this take? What were they looking for that could change the outcome? He had no answers, only the harsh reality that his entire life, his research, his reputation, and his peace of mind was hanging by a thread. The minutes dragged by, feeling like hours as Malik sat alone in the small room. His mind was spinning with thoughts, questions, and doubts. What was taking so long? Why hadn't they called his office yet? He had told them everything they needed to know. The paperwork was there, clear, official, and legitimate. But for some reason, it didn't seem to matter. The longer he waited, the more his anxiety grew. It was as if he was stuck in an endless loop, a situation he couldn't escape from. Every sound outside the room felt amplified, the quiet shuffle of feet, the distant murmur of voices, each one heightening his sense of isolation. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being judged for something he hadn't done. He had followed all the rules, done everything by the book, and yet here he was. Alone, in a holding room, treated like a criminal. The unfairness of it all gnawed at him, but he refused to let his anger get the better of him. He had to stay calm. He couldn't afford to make things worse. Suddenly, the door opened, and Malik looked up, startled. The male ranger from earlier stepped in first, followed by the female ranger. But this time, there was a noticeable difference. The rangers were no longer holding their previous hostile expressions. The male ranger seemed slightly less sure of himself, his posture more relaxed. The female ranger, however, still held herself with an air of authority, but there was something in her eyes that had softened just a little. It was almost as if they had been given new instructions, or perhaps something had changed in the way they viewed him. Malik's heart skipped a beat as the female ranger spoke. "We've verified your story," she said, her voice quieter than it had been before. "Your permits are valid. We made a mistake." Malik couldn't believe his ears. A mistake? That was all it took? They had treated him like a criminal, put him through hours of stress, and now it was all just a mistake? He struggled to keep his emotions in check, but the words stung. He had been treated like an outsider, as if he didn't belong, and now they were casually brushing it off as a simple error. The male ranger nodded, his expression still serious but less confrontational. "We apologize for the inconvenience," he said, but his apology felt hollow, lacking any real sincerity. It was clear that the damage had already been done. Malik had been arrested, taken to the station, and held in a room for questioning, all because of a mistake that could have been avoided in the first place. Malik stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He was exhausted physically and emotionally. "I don't understand how this could happen," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I've followed all the procedures. I have the permits. I was here to work. How could you do this?" The female ranger didn't answer right away, her gaze shifting between Malik and the male ranger. It was as if she wasn't entirely sure how to respond. "We didn't know who you were when we first approached you," she said eventually, her voice soft but firm. "We assumed you were someone who didn't belong, and we acted on that assumption." The words hit Malik harder than he expected. It wasn't just that they had made a mistake, they had made an assumption about him based on how he looked, based on the color of his skin. The realization sank in like a weight in his chest. It wasn't just the arrest, the handcuffs, or the questioning. It was the fact that he had been treated as if he didn't belong, as if he were an outsider, solely because of his race. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "So you arrested me because of the way I look?" he asked, his words almost a whisper. "Is that it?" The female ranger looked uncomfortable, her gaze faltering for a moment. "No, that's not what we meant. But it's true that we didn't make the effort to get to know you before making our decision." Malik took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The frustration still bubbled inside him, but he knew he had to stay calm. He couldn't let his emotions get the better of him now. If he did, nothing would change. He had to be the voice of reason in this moment. He had to make them see what they had done, and perhaps, just perhaps, that could lead to change. "You treated me like I was a criminal," Malik said, his voice growing stronger. "You didn't even give me a chance. You didn't even ask the right questions. You just assumed that because I was a black man, I didn't belong here. And that's not just a mistake, it's a problem." The male ranger looked at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "We weren't thinking like that," he said, though his words sounded less convincing than before. "You don't have to think like that consciously for it to happen," Malik replied, his voice steady but firm. "It's how the system works. It's how people who look like me get treated every day. And it's why things like this continue to happen." There was a long silence. The female ranger shifted uncomfortably on her feet, glancing down at the floor for a moment. It was clear that she wasn't used to being challenged in this way, and Malik could sense that the conversation was beginning to make her question her own actions. The male ranger, too, seemed to be taking in what Malik was saying, though he didn't speak again. Malik didn't know what the outcome of this conversation would be. He didn't know if these rangers would truly understand what had just happened or if they would simply walk away, convinced they had done nothing wrong. But in that moment, he knew he had to say something. He had to speak up, not just for himself, but for every person who had been unfairly treated, every person who had been judged before they had even been given a chance. "I understand that you're just doing your job," Malik continued. "But your job should be about protecting everyone, not just the people you're comfortable with. You have to do better. You have to see people for who they are, not just how they look." The female ranger finally nodded, though her expression remained solemn. "We'll take your words into consideration," she said quietly. "And we'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Malik didn't know if he believed her, but he wasn't expecting an immediate change. What mattered was that he had spoken up. He had forced them to confront the truth, even if it was uncomfortable for them. And maybe, just maybe, that would make a difference in the long run. As he was escorted out of the room and back toward the door, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't over. This wasn't the end of the road. It was only the beginning. Malik stepped out of the police station into the harsh daylight, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud. The air outside was sharp, the breeze carrying a chill that seemed to match the heaviness in his chest. The tension of the last few hours still clung to him like a thick fog. He had been released, his name cleared, but the emotional weight of what had just happened felt unbearable. The officers had apologized, but their words lacked true remorse. There was no fixing what had been broken, no undoing the fear, the humiliation, the unfair treatment. The damage, Malik realized, went far beyond his personal experience. It was part of a larger system that had failed him, and so many others like him, time and time again. As he walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk, Malik's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with the rangers. The brief exchange had been enlightening, yet frustrating. They had acknowledged their mistake, yes, but their understanding seemed shallow. They hadn't fully grasped the implications of what had happened, the way that racial bias had silently influenced their decisions. Malik had seen it before, but every time it happened, it stung like it was the first time. He couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change. He had been given a second chance today, but how many others had not been so lucky? How many people had been arrested, treated unfairly, or worse, simply because of their appearance? He knew that he couldn't let this slide. He couldn't just walk away, accept the apology, and pretend everything was fine. That wouldn't change anything. He had to use this experience to fuel something bigger. He had to make sure that this incident didn't go unnoticed, that it wasn't brushed off as just another mistake. The drive home felt long, even though it was only a few miles. Malik kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were far away, running over every detail of what had happened that day. The confusion, the fear, the frustration, it all kept coming back to him in waves. He thought about his family, his colleagues, the people who knew him as a professional, as a scientist who had worked hard to get where he was. They would never have imagined him in this situation, in a police station, arrested and accused of something he hadn't done. He knew they'd be shocked when he told them, but he wasn't sure how to explain it. How do you explain something like this? When Malik finally pulled into his driveway, he sat in the car for a moment, taking a deep breath. He didn't want to face his family just yet. He didn't want to tell them about what had happened, how he had been treated as a criminal, how he had been arrested for simply existing in a space that was meant to be open to all. He didn't want to make them feel the anger that was still simmering inside him. But he knew he had to. He knew that this wasn't something he could keep to himself. This was bigger than him. It was about changing a system that had been broken for far too long. As he stepped out of the car and made his way to the front door, Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his colleague, Sarah, asking if he was okay. He had mentioned in passing earlier that morning that he would be spending the day at the park, and she was likely wondering why he hadn't checked in. Malik hesitated for a moment, the weight of his emotions making it hard to type the words. How could he explain this over a text? How could he possibly sum up everything he had been through in a few sentences? He took a deep breath and began typing. I was arrested at the park today. They thought I was trespassing, but I had all the proper permits. It was a misunderstanding, but it was also something else, something bigger. I'll explain later. He hit send before he could second guess himself, then dropped his phone back into his pocket. As he walked inside, he was greeted by the warm embrace of his mother, who was sitting in the living room reading a book. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile. How was your day, Malik? Did you get the research done? Malik paused, standing at the doorway for a moment, trying to find the right words. The question felt so simple, so innocent, but everything inside him told him he couldn't lie. He couldn't pretend that everything had gone smoothly when the truth was far from it. Actually, he said slowly, I didn't get much done. There was a situation at the park. His mother put the book down and stood up, concern immediately flooding her expression. What do you mean? What happened? Malik hesitated. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness, everything he had felt in the last few hours seemed to rise up all at once. But as he stood there, looking at his mother, he realized that this was the moment he had been dreading. He had to tell her the truth, even though it pained him to say it out loud. They thought I was trespassing, Malik said quietly. They arrested me. The park rangers. I was doing research, Mom. I had all the right paperwork, all the permits. But they didn't believe me. They assumed I didn't belong there. His mother's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she was silent. Then, her voice broke through the stillness. Oh, Malik, no. Not you. Not after all the hard work you've done. She walked over to him and wrapped her arms around him tightly. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I can't even imagine how you must be feeling. Malik closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment to feel the comfort of her embrace. He had been so focused on his own emotions, on the anger and frustration that had bubbled up inside him, that he had forgotten to consider how this would affect his family. They were the ones who had supported him, who had believed in him when no one else did. And now, they were the ones who would feel the sting of this injustice with him. I'm okay, Mom, Malik said softly, pulling back from the hug. I'm just trying to make sense of it all. They apologized, but I don't think they really understand what they did. It wasn't just about me. It's about the system, how people like me are treated before we even get a chance to prove who we are. His mother nodded, her face filled with understanding. I know, Malik. I know. But I'm proud of you for speaking up. That's what matters. You don't let this define you. You keep moving forward. Malik smiled faintly, grateful for her support. It was hard to explain everything he was feeling, but he knew that his mother, and his family, would be there to help him make sense of it. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the fight for change would require more than just his voice, but it was a fight he was willing to take on. Because he knew that if he didn't, nothing would ever change. He couldn't let this injustice go unnoticed.